Bueno, pues muchas gracias a Agustín, muchas gracias a todos ustedes, buenas noches. Es un gusto presentar este panel sobre mejores prácticas internacionales en la implementación de la mejora regulatoria a nivel local. Como hemos venido platicando a lo largo de esta conferencia nacional, una de las principales herramientas que tenemos para mejorar nuestras prácticas es conocer lo que se hace en otras latitudes, en otras entidades federativas, en otros municipios. Y una de las cosas que la COFEMER puede constatar es que el aprender de donde se han generado mejores prácticas, como en ciertos centros de investigación, organismos internacionales, y lo que vienen aplicando otros países, puede ser referencia para mejorar también nuestras prácticas. En ese sentido es que voy a tener el honor de presentar este panel, en el que contamos con la presencia de dos personas que no solo son grandes expertos en materia de mejora regulatoria, sino que además tengo el gusto de presentar a dos buenos amigos, el señor Frey de la Oficina de Información y Asuntos Regulatorios de la Casa Blanca de Estados Unidos, y el señor Trnka, analista senior de política de la División de Política Regulatoria de la OCDE. Voy a permitirme leer de manera muy rápida sus reseñas. Frey, como lo comenté, forma parte de la Oficina de Información y Asuntos Regulatorios de la Casa Blanca. Él tiene un grado en Relaciones Internacionales por la Universidad Lewis and Clark y una maestría en Derecho y Diplomacia por la Universidad de Tufts. Él dirige la rama ejecutiva que supervisa la regulación federal de energía y medio ambiente, además de proveer soporte técnico a las agencias gubernamentales en la implementación de análisis costo-beneficio y política de información. En su carrera como servidor público, Nathan ha servido en las administraciones del presidente Bush y del presidente Obama, brindando análisis a oficiales de alto nivel de la Casa Blanca para asegurar que las políticas de regulación federal sean consistentes con las prioridades de la administración. Lideró esfuerzos de cooperación regulatoria bilateral entre Estados Unidos y México a través del Alto Consejo de Cooperación Regulatoria y funge como consultor experto de iniciativas del Foro de Cooperación Económica Asia-Pacífico APEC y la OCDE, que promueven buenas prácticas regulatorias en América Latina. Previo a su servicio en la Oficina de Información y Asuntos Regulatorios, como AIRA, como es conocida en Estados Unidos, Nathan trabajó como consultor para el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo en América Central en temas de administración de áreas protegidas. El señor Trnka, que ya dije es analista senior de políticas en la División de Política Regulatoria de la OCDE, es autor y coautor de diversas publicaciones, incluyendo recomendaciones del Consejo de la OCDE en Política Regulatoria y Gobernanza, reduciendo la burocracia, ¿por qué es tan complicada la simplificación administrativa? Principios en mejores prácticas para cumplimiento de regulaciones e inspecciones, revisiones de simplificación administrativa en Polonia y en Vietnam, de política regulatoria en México, Kazajstán, Lituania y de medición de cargas administrativas en Grecia. Daniel ha sido director del Departamento de Reforma Regulatoria y Calidad de Administración Pública del Ministerio del Interior de la República Checa. Sus principales áreas de especialización son la simplificación administrativa, la manifestación de impacto regulatorio, participación de interesados en el proceso regulatorio y el cumplimiento de regulaciones e inspecciones. Finalmente, hay que mencionar que Daniel ha trabajado en el área de administración pública y reforma regulatoria por más de 15 años, tanto a nivel nacional como internacional. De esta manera me permitiría ceder el uso de la palabra a Nathan Frey de los Estados Unidos de América. Un fuerte aplauso para él.
Thank you, Eduardo. And I'd first like to thank the hosts from the government of the state of Mexico for putting on such a great event and for inviting me to be here and sharing this experience with you all today. I'd also like to thank my friends at COFEMER and OECD for helping to facilitate my attendance as well. I promise I will be incredibly brief. I know I'm standing between you and Mojitos and Victorias. Get in the way of that. So I want to start by making a reflection, and that's to acknowledge just how profoundly integrated the concept of regulatory improvement and regulatory cooperation has been integrated within the global economic dialogue. We need only look so far as the recent signing of the TPP and and the fact that 1 out of 4 chapters of that very difficultly negotiated agreement was focused on regulatory coherence. That tells us a few things. It tells us how important it is in the global economic context, and that this is not a concept that's going away. It's only going to become more important for our shared economies. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the best practices of regulatory policy in the US. And I want you to keep in mind that although this applies to the US context, there are key takeaways that can be brought to bear on the context of your state context. So can we go to the next slide, please? So I like to think in threes because that's the way it's easier to remember things. And the 3 things I want to take away from this talk are the importance of having a whole of government approach to regulatory policy. It's important that we apply the best practices to the same actors in the same way each time, so that we know we are not politicizing the importance of our regulatory practices. And when I describe how that works in the US, I'm going to focus on 2 things: the role of centralized management and review of regulatory actions, and the importance of interagency coordination of rulemaking. I'm also going to focus a little bit on the importance of the role of regulatory impact analysis as a decision-making tool, as well as, of course, the theme of transparency and accountability in the regulatory process. So if you would skip forward 4 slides, please. See, I'm trying to be quick. So when we talk about centralized management and leadership and oversight of regulatory policy in the federal US context, you can see here that this concept goes back to the 1960s. And what does that say? It says it's not only a good idea, but it's also an apolitical idea. It's one that has stood the test of time and has demonstrated to each and every administration that it's important to have a centralized point of focus to make sure that each and every regulator is adhering to the same principles and practices in the same way. 2 slides ahead, please. So in the US, as Eduardo mentioned, the office that is responsible for making sure this centralized, can you go back one, please? Making sure this centralized review happens is called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the White House. And in fact, interestingly, OIRA, which is the acronym, was established through a legislative act called the Paperwork Reduction Act. And that's in part because in the 1980s, there was an explosion of regulation that happened with the market crashes and the acknowledgement that the market can't provide all the solutions for fixing social problems. But the executive branch took it a little too far, way too many regulations, and Congress said, stop. You need to have some control over what you're doing. And the Paperwork Reduction Act is our administrative simplification mandate. And it says, if the government is going to impose a burden on society, it has to do so in the most efficient way, and it has to demonstrate by law that that burden is going to be justified. So in part, the takeaway here is that it's not often enough to have a desire, a will, or even a mandate from the executive branch to carry out certain administrative functions. Oftentimes we need a legal underpinning to make sure that those imperatives take place. So if you would skip forward 2 slides, please. So the founding document that gives the direction to the centralized oversight body of the US, or OIRA, is called Executive Order 12866. Not a very descriptive or sexy title, but a very important one nonetheless. This is essentially the Bible of how regulatory policy works in the US. And the main takeaway is it established key principles for how we regulate. And I'll go through some of those. So obviously, regulation must be consistent with law. We cannot deviate from the authority granted by the Congress and the executive in a way that is inconsistent with that intent. Fundamentally, this may seem oversimplified, but let's make sure that if we're going to regulate, we're defining the problem that we're trying to solve effectively. If we're not, then what are we doing? Let's make sure that when we regulate, we consider alternatives to our preferred choice, to make sure that we fully consider all the potential views of how to solve that particular problem. How we make sure that we do that is we look at costs and benefits. We have a structured analysis platform to make sure that we look at those alternatives in a very concrete and objective way, looking at the cost and benefit of each one of those options. And most importantly, this has been touched on by many of the Mexican colleagues, we better make absolutely sure that the choice that we make is going to maximize the net benefits to society. That is our imperative as regulators, as government servants, to make sure that our interventions are serving the people effectively. Next slide, please. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that we can have an oversight body. We can have control over regulators, but there better be control over the oversight body as well. We should also be accountable to the system. So we have to have some filters for how we choose to conduct that oversight. You can only imagine there are thousands and thousands of regulations that are issued in Mexico every year. If COFEMER and Economia and the authorities in Mexico were to scrutinize each and every single one of those regulations, none would ever get issued. So we have that acknowledgement in the US, and we only review certain regulations that fit certain criteria. Those that raise new legal or policy issues, those that significantly impact the mandates of other agencies, and those that materially impact the budget, the federal budget. So out of about 6,000 regulations that are issued each year in the US, OIRA only reviews about 500 of those. Now, a subset of those 500 are what we call economically significant rules. Those that impact the economy $100 million or more in any one year. And of those subset, about 70 to 100 out of the 500, we require a very rigorous economic analysis, RIA, of the agencies issuing those rules. It only makes sense, right, that those most impactful regulations should receive the most scrutiny by the oversight body. Next slide. So there's additional discipline placed on OIRA to make sure that we are not causing a bottleneck in the process. We only have 90 days to review rules. We don't cover certain agencies that are delegated authority directly by Congress. And as I mentioned before, perhaps our most important role is maintaining our function as ensuring that regulatory impact analysis is conducted in a transparent way so that the public knows how decisions are made and why. 2 slides ahead, please. So I mentioned before the Bible of how OIRA conducts, oversees regulatory policy in the US. And I think it's important to acknowledge that although that forms the pillar of how we function, there's a need to continuously improve, continuously evaluate opportunities to make the system more efficient and effective. And President Obama has acknowledged this with his own mark on the federal regulatory process. And perhaps most interestingly, he introduced the concept of retrospective regulatory review, ex post evaluation of existing regulations. So that instills a further layer of discipline within the agencies, within the regulators, to make sure that if they're going to regulate, they're doing so in the most effective way. And this mandate requires them to periodically evaluate that effectiveness. How do they do that? They look to the regulatory impact analysis, which clearly defines the alternatives considered and the cost of benefits associated with each of those alternatives, and allows them to easily see what we're doing today, whether that matches with the choice that we made when we issued the regulation. Next slide, please. So just a little deeper dive on the regulatory impact analysis, because that really serves as the backbone of how our regulatory system functions efficiently and effectively. As I mentioned before, the basic goal, starting place, is making sure that we're maximizing net benefits to society. How are we doing that? We're looking at alternatives. We are analyzing the costs and benefits of each of those alternatives, and we are making sure that the choice that we make among those alternatives is the one that maximizes the net benefits. We have a guide to agencies for how they are to conduct that analysis. It's called Circular A4. It's been around since 2003, so it's also stood the test of political time. And I'll have a link to that at the end of the presentation for you all to go and find that and take a look for yourselves. Next slide. This is a topic that everyone's touched on, but I think in the US, the interesting fact is that the concept of regulatory transparency and participation really began in 1946 with a law called the Administrative Procedures Act, which in essence required agencies before issuing a regulation to publish the regulation for the stakeholders to comment on, and then require the regulator to respond to those comments in a public way. Next slide, please. I think a lot of focus on regulatory policy and a lot of concern from the part of the government goes to this concept of regulatory capture, the role that outside stakeholders, industry can play in influencing regulatory decision making. In the US, we're really focused on that as well, and we've instituted some procedures to make sure that we're accountable to making sure that doesn't happen. So when a regulation is under review by OIRA, each and every communication that takes place between the agency and OIRA is made public. Meetings with outside parties when they want to come in and lobby the White House are made public. Every person that attended that meeting, what the topics were, and any information they left with us is made public. That's to say that you can't prevent any and all regulatory capture, but having a few key mechanisms in place can really go a long way to assuring the public that there are no secrets. Next slide. This is just our website for showing regulatory information to the public. Anyone can go there and see. It's called regulations.gov. Which regulations are under review currently in OIRA. You can request a meeting with us through that website. There's information that's searchable by any document you want to find that's relevant to that regulation that you're interested in. And we're in a process of continuously trying to improve the usability of this website, something that we fully acknowledge is a work in progress. Next slide, please. A couple more just issues of transparency that are really helpful, I think, for the public in the U.S. One is the Unified Regulatory Agenda, which is a public issuance of forward-looking plans that each regulator is required to issue biannually, showing the whole regulatory program of work for that year. that gives people a heads up of what's coming and allows them to plan ahead for how to comply with those regulations and also influence them. And finally, the next slide. So, conclusions. Having a commitment that stands the test of time to a whole of government approach to good regulatory practices is really key to ensuring the public's confidence in the regulatory process. As you saw in the US, you take away one thing, is that that concept hasn't changed for 40, 50 years. And that says that, most importantly, I think it's not a political issue in the US. It's a good governance issue. Second, an effective regulatory program is really dependent on good regulatory impact analysis to make sure that we're showing the work of how we make decisions. We're letting the public know how each and every decision that is very impactful for them as stakeholders was made in a transparent way. And finally, having transparent and accountable procedures to make sure that meetings with outside parties, that regulatory capture is being accounted for by the government, and that there are no secrets for how these decisions are made. So that was a quick and oversimplified outline of how the regulatory system in the U.S. works and some of the key pillars of our system. Hopefully there's some takeaways from you in your context. The next slide has some key resources for you to refer to. I would like for this presentation to be publicly available for you to look at and to go check out these websites for yourself, because there's some great resources there. With that, thank you, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Pues muchas gracias a Nathan Frey por su presentación. Creo que es muy ilustrativa de cómo los Estados Unidos han sido un modelo y una referencia para muchos países del mundo en la aplicación de la política de mejora regulatoria. Hay que señalar, me imagino que vieron las fechas que estaban ahí y los años que estaban en muchas de las láminas que usó Nathan. Se dieron cuenta que la participación ciudadana a través de procesos de consulta pública, que los ciudadanos puedan participar del quehacer regulatorio, es una práctica que en Estados Unidos se impuso en un acto de procedimiento administrativo en 1946. Es decir, llevan muchos años haciendo algo que acá también tenemos muchos años, pero lo hicimos tantito después de ellos, y que en muchos países se ha vuelto una práctica común y conocida como de muy buena aplicación. La manifestación de impacto regulatorio, como le llamamos en México, una herramienta que introdujo el presidente Carter y que después formalizó el presidente Reagan, y que se ha vuelto referencia para todos los países del mundo también, y es una herramienta que diversos organismos como el Foro Económico Asia-Pacífico y la OCDE promueven para mejorar tanto el marco regulatorio vigente como el flujo regulatorio. Y en ese sentido únicamente destacaría dos puntos muy esenciales que repitió constantemente Nathan en su presentación: el tema de que hay que utilizar este tipo de herramientas como la consulta pública y como el análisis de impacto regulatorio como herramientas para mejorar el beneficio social que brindan las regulaciones hacia la ciudadanía, para sacar el máximo provecho de la intervención gubernamental en favor de la actividad económica y de la eficiencia en los mercados. Y por otra parte, que hay otra serie de herramientas que deben ir acompañando este proceso, que deben ser aplicadas de manera sistemática para que esto sea una política aplicable en todo el gobierno y no solamente políticas de administración, sino que se vuelvan políticas de Estado, y que para ello es importante establecer esto en instrumentos normativos, como lo han hecho muchos países, como en el caso de Estados Unidos, y aplicar otras herramientas como ellos lo hacen, como este tema de la planificación regulatoria unificada, como este tema que utilizan el regulations.gov, en donde cualquier regulación puede ser vista en su portal de internet, y hay una herramienta colaborativa en donde pueden ver los comentarios de cualquier persona y comentar sobre el comentario de alguien más como si estuvieran editando un documento en Word. Y son herramientas muy innovadoras que los Estados Unidos han venido promoviendo a través de foros como APEC, y que afortunadamente nos han servido de referencia. Y sintetizándolo en el contexto de esta conferencia, que pueden ser muy útiles para nosotros conocerlas, porque también son aplicables a nivel estatal, también son aplicables a nivel municipal, como en el caso de la manifestación de impacto regulatorio y la consulta pública, que como saben forman parte de los 21 puntos de la Agenda Común de Mejora Regulatoria impulsada por la COFEMER, por la ANS de la CONAGUA y la CONATRIM, y que sin lugar a dudas nos puede servir saber cómo lo hacen en otras latitudes del mundo para aplicarlas de mejor forma. Entonces, de nuevo agradezco la participación de Nathan Frey, y con esto cedería el uso de la palabra a Daniel Trnka, por favor.
Thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to be here in Mexico, and especially in a very nice place like this. I would really like to thank the organizers and especially Manuel Gerardo for inviting me to this wonderful conference. It's a real pleasure for me. I was asked to present briefly some conclusions from our new flagship publication that is called the Regulatory Policy Outlook. Now, having said that, this publication is going to be officially launched only next week on the 28th of October at the ministerial meeting in Helsinki in Finland. So take this presentation as a teaser, actually, revealing some preliminary conclusions from the publication. We are actually not allowed to reveal any results of the survey, but I got a permission to show you one slide, and I promise you will like it. But it's only at the end of the presentation, so you will have to bear with me for the next couple of minutes. So we believe that the publication is really the first of its kind, because it's based on a large survey of all OECD member countries plus the European Commission. So it means 35 different constituencies. And it's based on a large survey. We sent out a questionnaire that contained more than 1,000 questions, actually. So you can imagine that we got a lot of data. We tried to analyze them and come up with some kind of conclusions. It's based on our 2012 OECD recommendation on regulatory policy and governance. It contains the data, it contains some graphs and charts, but we also focus a little bit more in depth on three important tools of regulatory policy. These are regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post reviews of regulations. And today I'm going to focus mostly only on stakeholder engagement. But very briefly, some more general conclusions. We see that the governments, the OECD governments, set a very ambitious goal with these 2012 recommendations. So in other words, none of the OECD countries is there yet. The principles are really very ambitious. It's sort of our goal for the future. Some countries are doing better, some countries are doing worse in some aspects, but it's really interesting to see the tremendous progress that has been made in the last, say, 10, 15 years. And we really see that more and more countries are showing signs of adopting a whole of government complex regulatory policies, and in more and more countries there are formal requirements to conduct regulatory impact assessment, to engage with stakeholders as part of the regulatory policy. So it's a real pleasure for us to really see this progress. Few words about stakeholder engagement. Well, this graph really illustrates what I have just said, if you can actually read it, which you probably can't. But basically it says that 32 out of these 35 countries plus the European Commission have some kind of formal requirement to conduct stakeholder engagement, especially when developing new regulations. 62% of our countries have a requirement to engage with stakeholders when developing all regulations, and 15% more on major regulations. But this is quite a progress. There are different goals and different advantages of conducting stakeholder engagement. Can I ask for the next slide, because this thing doesn't seem to be working? Yeah. So there are sort of, I would say, philosophical goals. We are all democratic countries, and our citizens and other stakeholders actually have a right to be part of the process of making new regulations and making these important decisions. But there are also practical aspects of this. When engaging with stakeholders, you can actually get better input. Believe it or not, we civil servants do not know everything, even though we sometimes think so. But we do not. And when we consult with stakeholders, we can actually get some interesting information about the real-world impacts of our regulations, about different solutions to problems, so not just solving every single problem with a new law or a new regulation. So it's really beneficial to engage with stakeholders. And in addition, if you take them on board, you increase the sort of a sense of ownership. So they see the laws and the regulations as their own, as something they have co-produced with the government. And then it's actually more likely, and the data proves that, it's more likely that the stakeholders will actually comply with these regulations. I will skip the next slide, but I would like to say a very important message to you, which is contained in the regulatory policy outlook. Stakeholder engagement is not the same as public consultations. Public consultations are a very important part of it, but there is more to that than just consulting public. We see three different levels of stakeholder engagement. At the lowest level, you have notification, which is basically a one-way process of communicating between the government and the stakeholders. So you inform them about something, you do not expect any feedback. On the higher level are public consultations, which is a two-way process. You inform stakeholders about something, about your decisions, about your legislative drafts, and you get some feedback from them. That's good, but still it's not enough. We believe that the highest level of stakeholder engagement is actually active participation of stakeholders in the whole process of making and reviewing regulations. So in some countries like Denmark, for example, they send their civil servants out to spend the day in a farm, to spend the night with a truck driver, to see really what regulations, what kind of impact regulations have on the daily life of citizens, businesses, entrepreneurs, etc. And then they invite the farmers and the truck drivers back to their offices, and together they are trying to think about simplification proposals. They use post-its, they draw diagrams on whiteboard, and together they work together to find these solutions. We believe these should be the ultimate
soluciones, y esta es la meta final para el involucramiento de los.
And also, sorry, I skipped the slide. Also, you should engage with the stakeholder throughout the whole regulatory governance cycle. In other words, when you are thinking about dealing with the problem at the government level, you should consult the stakeholders. Is that the real problem? Is really regulation the best solution to this problem? When you decide that regulation is the best solution to the problem, again, you should consult with the stakeholders to see the impacts of different options, to evaluate which option is the best. When you finally adopt the regulation, you are trying to implement it and to enforce it, you should engage with the stakeholders to find the best way how to enforce your regulation. And then at the end, when you're trying to review and monitor how regulations are actually working well, you should engage with the stakeholders because they know better than you do as civil servants. So you should really consult throughout the whole cycle. And actually, our data show that mostly governments are doing it only when drafting new regulations and at the end of the process. Even though countries are now using the wider portfolio of different engagement tools, not sure if you can read it, but there's a really portfolio of different tools. Some of them are more suitable for different phases of the cycle, some of them are more suitable for states and municipalities, some of them are more useful for national level. The portfolio is wider, but still
Es más amplio el portafolio de las herramientas, pero los países no están haciendo todavía suficiente, aunque sí es más en revisión y en hacer cumplir. En general es solo en la última fase que prevalece las consultas en esa última fase. Aquí en la mano derecha se ve que en la mayoría de los países es en la parte final, cuando está el texto ya uno no quiere cambiarlo. En muchos países ponen el texto en internet, reciben algún comentario y hacen caso omiso. Y pueden decir, sí, hicimos una consulta pública, pero eso no fue útil para el resultado final. Hay otras metas que quisiera mencionar, solo algunos. Bueno, involucramiento de actores requiere muchos recursos, no solo para el gobierno, pero para el otro lado también. Es tiempo, recursos. Algunos están dispuestos, pero no quieren. Algunos quieren hacerlo, pero no saben cómo. Están dispuestos, pero no pueden. Y el gobierno tiene que ir a ellos para ver esos que no están dispuestos, para sacar la información de ahí. El gobierno tiene que ser más proactivo para recibir esa información de los actores. En muchos países, los actores no saben cómo y que pueden ser parte del proceso. Y en algunos países tuvieron malas experiencias porque cuando intentan entregar comentario y no reciben respuesta, de que han hecho caso omiso de sus comentarios, entonces otra vez uno va a ir a nadar ese día en vez de involucrarse. Y también hemos visto el uso de las TICs, son herramientas importantes, hacen que las cosas vayan más rápido, se puede poner muchas cosas en internet o puede ser demasiado. Algunos gobiernos están viendo Twitter y Facebook, redes sociales, pero la experiencia muestra que la cultura y la actitud no ha cambiado, así que tenemos nuevas herramientas, pero no hemos cambiado la manera de pensar, lo usamos de la misma manera que lo usábamos con las viejas herramientas. En un ejemplo, en el Reino Unido tenían una reta de papeleo, cualquiera podía comentar en internet, recibieron miles y miles de comentarios, pero vieron que el 90% era totalmente inútil. Estaban comentando acerca de diferentes regulaciones, regulaciones que ya no existían, así que invirtieron muchos recursos, pero la utilidad del proceso fue cuestionable. Esta es una gráfica que muestra que la mayoría de los países usan sitios web clásicos, algunos experimentan con nuevas herramientas como LinkedIn, Twitter y Facebook. Las últimas preguntas que tengo es si el involucramiento de los actores está logrando lo que queríamos. No sabemos, aunque los gobiernos, los países están involucrándose más con los actores, no evalúan si estos procesos son útiles para ellos. Hay falta de evaluación. No saben lo que están tratando de lograr. Quieren mejor información de entrada para analizar cuáles son los criterios. Están contando el número de consultas durante el año, pero es un indicador, pero no les dice nada. Algunos cuentan el número de comentarios. Bueno, si recibes miles de comentarios, ¿significa que están involucrando a los actores o significa que tienes un texto muy malo de propuesta de ley o tal vez un grupo de cabildeo muy fuerte que movilizó a la gente para enviar los comentarios. Tenemos que enfocarnos en los resultados. Sí, involucramiento de los actores lleva a mejores leyes, a mejor marco regulatorio, pero no hemos llegado ahí todavía. Debemos intentar evaluar y mejorar los procesos de involucramiento de actores. Es muy bueno tener las consultas públicas, pero tiene que llevar a mejora regulatoria. Les prometí que les iba a mostrar una gráfica, les voy a mostrar dos acerca de México, cómo le va a México. En esto es solo uno de los indicadores. Bueno, los nombres los he quitado, excepto México, es el último a la mano derecha en rojo, así que le está yendo muy bien, así que felicidades.
This graph concerns primary laws,
Esta gráfica tiene que ver con las leyes primarias y para secundarias, básicamente más o menos lo mismo. Bueno, esta diapositiva es una propaganda para el panorama para políticas regulatorias, saldrá el 28 de octubre. Gracias por su atención.
Listo. Pues también quisiera agradecer a Trnka por su interesante exposición. Sé que todos se habrán puesto más atención en la última gráfica que en toda la demás presentación, pero bueno, es un trabajo que la OCDE hace de manera permanente. Está revisando cómo los países que integramos el organismo, más la Comisión de la Unión Europea, estamos haciendo las recomendaciones que hace el organismo en materia de mejora regulatoria. Como lo comentó Daniel, en 2012 el Consejo sobre Política y Gobernanza Regulatoria de la OCDE emitió 12 recomendaciones en materia de mejora regulatoria y actualmente están midiendo 3 de ellas en este estudio que dio a conocer Daniel, que tienen que ver con participación ciudadana o consulta pública. Para nosotros suena mejor en nuestro idioma, pero bueno, como nos decía Daniel, no es lo mismo consulta pública que promover que los ciudadanos se involucren en todas las etapas del proceso regulatorio. La segunda práctica, como lo dijo en la mañana también el secretario Ildefonso Guajardo, es la manifestación de impacto regulatorio, y la tercera es la evaluación expuesta a través de distintos métodos, prácticas y herramientas. Y destacaría únicamente, porque ya lo dijo todo Daniel, pero únicamente destacaría el tema de que es muy importante conocer cómo todos estamos aplicando los procesos de consulta cuando hacemos regulación en todas las etapas del ciclo regulatorio. No solamente hay que consultar cuando estamos creando una nueva regulación o cuando tenemos un borrador de regulación. Por ejemplo, cuando estamos diseñando la agenda regulatoria, la agenda de mejora regulatoria, es bien importante consultar al sector privado. En los programas bienales de mejora regulatoria de 2015-2016, la COFEMER hizo una extensa consulta pública tanto en medios electrónicos como a través de foros presenciales, en los que inclusive muchos de ustedes estuvieron directamente de los afectados por la regulación, qué es lo que está pasando. Como nos decía Daniel, bien importante, independientemente de si estamos hablando del gobierno federal, de un gobierno estatal o de un gobierno municipal, bien importante tener la información directamente de quienes están siendo regulados, de quienes son los potenciales afectados por la regulación, para tener todos los elementos que nos permitan hacerlo de la mejor forma y tomar las mejores decisiones. Entonces, no me restaría más que pedirles nuevamente un aplauso para nuestros dos expositores. Y pedir al ingeniero Arturo Caballero, quien es subsecretario de Desarrollo Económico del Estado de Quintana Roo, nos haga el honor de acompañarnos para entregar el reconocimiento respectivo al señor Frey. Y a el licenciado David Samay Castilla, coordinador general de proyectos especiales de la Comisión Federal de Mejora Regulatoria. Entonces a Gabriela Montaño, coordinadora de estados y municipios de la COFEMER, que por favor nos haga favor de entregar el reconocimiento a Daniel Trnka.